if Parliament votes down the Prime Minister's deal, or she can't reach a deal, that is not the end of the debate. But if that's not possible, we must have other options. And conference, that must include campaigning for a public vote. Having swept them away, we want to install a radical Labour government capable of transforming this country. And that's what should happen after 2 years of negotiations ending in failure.
The royal halls hadn't seen such fury in decades. News of Keir Starmer's latest policy move had barely reached the countryside before the backlash exploded. What started as quiet whispers among farmers soon erupted into national chaos when it was revealed that citizens, ordinary voters and working farmers, were being arrested for failing to comply with vague, overreaching government directives. And when King Charles III was briefed on what had just transpired, his reaction shook the entire monarchy. It began with the rollout of what Starmer's government called the National Compliance and Regulation Enforcement Order, a sweeping set of measures aimed, according to official statements, at ensuring public cooperation with urgent sustainability goals and democratic preservation. In practice, it became something else entirely. Farmers across the country reported unannounced visits from government agents, arriving with legal mandates, inspecting livestock numbers, fuel usage, and water access permits.
You're right to say that we want to improve relations with the EU. We think we can get a better deal than the botched deal that Boris Johnson brought home. And we will work on that, understanding a very strong mandate now, a very strong mandate for change, for a different relationship with the EU, a different way of doing politics, and we go forward in that spirit. We do have to get on with implementing the important changes that are necessary under the existing arrangements that we've got, because we're not going to be able to get a better relationship unless we demonstrate a commitment to the relationship and the agreements that have already been put.
One by one, rural workers were led away in handcuffs for offences as minor as failing to reduce their tractor usage by a certain percentage. Rules they hadn't even been properly informed about. Meanwhile, in urban areas, voters who'd openly questioned Labour's proposals online found themselves flagged for public non-compliance behaviour. Several were brought in under the new Regulation Clause 7A, a catch-all provision that allowed arrest without bail for suspected digital insubordination. Critics said it was Orwellian. Supporters, though fewer and fewer by the day, called it necessary for national cohesion. The moment the king received an intelligence update on the arrests, he reportedly stood up mid-briefing and demanded clarification. When told the arrests were real and ongoing, he flew into a rage. Staff in the palace said they hadn't seen him raise his voice since the early days of the COVID crisis. But this time, it was different. This wasn't about policy, this was about the people. British citizens, some of whom had voted for Starmer himself, were being detained for refusing to follow unclear, bureaucratically dense orders with no due process.
I think even without reform, this government is off to the worst start of any government since Eden and the Suez Crisis in 1956. They are collapsing in terms of support. One of the arguments I made in the run-up to May the 1st was that many of our voters are people with alarms that go off at 5 o'clock in the morning. They go off to work. They work damned hard. And I think today, perhaps it's just a little opportunity for me perhaps to answer some of that. Reform really are now the party of working people. The new Prime Minister had to refer to his notes, scripted to the nth degree, clearly without any great feeling, meaning or passion for the job that was ahead.
The king's fist slammed against the table as he exclaimed, "This is not governance, this is coercion." While the monarchy is traditionally apolitical, sources close to the palace confirmed the king demanded an emergency private meeting with Prime Minister Starmer. The tone, firm, furious. Constitutional experts immediately began speculating whether this moment could trigger a rare royal intervention. While the monarch has no formal legislative power, there are mechanisms, quiet, rarely used, that allow the king to question, delay, or even block governmental actions under extraordinary circumstances. Many believed this was just such a moment. But Starmer wasn't backing down. In a cold, scripted press conference later that afternoon, he defended the arrests as unfortunate but essential. He claimed the country was facing compliance erosion that threatened the very framework of democracy. "We cannot allow individual preferences," he said, "to override collective progress." The comments sent shockwaves across the nation. Social media exploded with clips of farmers being dragged away, voters shouting at plainclothes officers, and citizens holding up signs that read, "Is this still Britain?" At Westminster, opposition leaders began demanding clarity. Nigel Farage took to the podium with a thunderous voice, blasting Starmer for what he called a Soviet-style betrayal of the British people. Liberal Democrats were equally alarmed, calling for a full parliamentary inquiry. Even several Labour MPs began quietly distancing themselves from Starmer's enforcement task force. Back at the palace, the King's fury hadn't cooled. Insiders said he was pacing for hours, making calls to constitutional advisors, former prime ministers, and human rights experts. His concern wasn't just about the arrests, it was about what this signalled. If we allow this, he reportedly told a senior advisor, we tear the very soul from this country's democracy. Overnight, protests began erupting in major cities. In Birmingham, thousands gathered in front of the city council building chanting, "Free the farmers, free the voters." A viral video showed a grandmother being pushed aside by a police officer for demanding the release of her son, arrested for organising a peaceful resistance barbecue in Yorkshire. What was once a minor policy dispute had become a national emergency. The next morning, the King addressed the nation. In a rare televised statement, his face grave and voice unshakably firm, he said, "Britain is a nation built on liberty and lawful dissent. Arresting our citizens without transparency, clarity, or compassion is unacceptable. I urge the government to reconsider its actions immediately." The broadcast drew millions of views and sent Parliament into a tailspin. Starmer, red-eyed and visibly agitated, responded with a second statement, attempting to justify the arrests as preventive actions against potential disorder. But it was too late. The damage was done. Human rights groups began issuing open letters. The UN weighed in, citing concerns of political overreach. International headlines screamed about a British democratic breakdown. Meanwhile, inside the government, tensions reached a boiling point. Whistleblowers within the compliance task force leaked documents revealing that the arrests had been pre-planned weeks in advance. Targets had been selected from a non-cooperation watch list compiled through social media data and anonymous citizen reports. It was clear now, this hadn't been a reaction, it had been orchestrated. Pressure on Starmer intensified by the hour. Rumours swirled that multiple cabinet ministers were threatening to resign if the arrest orders weren't immediately revoked. Legal teams across the country began filing injunctions. Judges caught between law and public outrage delayed rulings. And through it all, the King remained vocal, firm, and unshaken in his defence of the British people. The final nail came when a BBC journalist managed to interview one of the arrested farmers, recently released after a local MP intervened. The man in tears said, "I wasn't violent. I wasn't disobedient. I just didn't understand the form. Now I can't even look at my kids without feeling like a criminal." That single interview broke the dam. Under insurmountable pressure, Keir Starmer announced a full suspension of the enforcement orders, pending further legal review. But the nation was not satisfied. Trust had been shattered. Faith in leadership bruised, and the King, once a symbol, was now a force of moral reckoning.